Good evening, and welcome to the Museum of Modern Art. My name is Pablo Helguera, and I'm the Director of Adult and Academic Programs in the Education Department at MoMA. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to the third program of our One Work Conversation series. For those of you who are watching this program on our live stream, I want to welcome you as well. As part of our efforts to celebrate the reopening of MoMA and its reimagined galleries, this conversation series has been established to introduce and reintroduce the public to key, specific, and remarkable works in the collection by hearing directly from the artist about its making, the set of concerns that informed it, and its place within their artistic trajectory. Tonight, we're delighted to welcome Janet Cardiff and George Bures to discuss their work, The Killing Machine. Currently on view as part of the museum's exhibition surrounds 11 installations. They will be tonight in conversation with art director Glenn Lowry. Janet Cardiff and George Bures create immersive installations, art objects, walks, meaning audio recordings that guide viewers on short journeys through landscapes. The two began collaborating in 1983, and as is exemplified by their walks, their work often activates space through innovative interactions of sound and movement. The two first achieved international recognition for the walks in 1995. They represented Canada at the 49th Venice Biennial with Paradise Institute in 2001. For that piece, the artist won La Biennale di Venezia, a special award presented to Canadian artists for the very first time. Cardiff and Bures have recently had exhibitions at Frankel Gallery, San Francisco, the Art Gallery of Alberta, Fruit Market Gallery in Edinburgh, the Miami Art Museum, Vancouver Art Gallery, the National Gallery of Canada, and many others. They also have presented their work at Documenta 13, the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, D.C., and at the Museum of Modern Art, where we also received a major 2001 survey of the work at MoMA PS1. The format of the One Work series is very specific. The program is set for 1 hour, consisting in a conversation and a set of questions to the artists. Toward the end of the program, we will turn it over to questions from you, the audience, so please do think of things you might want to ask. At the end of the program, you are all invited to go upstairs to the 6th floor to experience the piece in person if you haven't had a chance yet to do so. Last but not least, because this is a new program series, we are looking for visitor feedback. So we would appreciate it if you could fill out a small form we have available outside of the theater at the end of the program. And now, without any further ado, please help me in welcoming Janet Cardiff, George Bures and Glenn Lowry. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Oops, sorry. I just thought I would thank Pablo and the entire staff of our education department for the great job they do, for having conceived these evenings devoted to a single work, to, in a sense, learn from artists, not only how they make work, but how they think about their own work. And I just want to shout out at the same time a recognition of the entire staff of the museum. As many of you know, we opened the new museum on October 21st, and we have been working flat out to fine-tune what we do. And so we not only welcome your feedback about this program, we welcome your feedback about the museum in general. And I also want to recognize Peter Oleksik in the Department of Conservation, because they work tirelessly to make not only all of the works of art that are on view available and ready to be seen, but particularly on Killing Machine. And as you'll learn over the course of this conversation, it's not a simple little project. It's quite a complicated one. Maybe we might, George, because we spent such an enormous effort on making sure it worked properly. Do you want to talk a little bit about just the manufacture of it? What goes into making this?
Well, it's a complicated piece. There's a lot of moving parts. How many people have seen the piece actually live? Oh, so quite a few. Okay, great. Yeah, and so why did we even think we could make something like that?
Well, first we started with the idea of about 8 robots, and then when we built one and realized how crazy it could be and how much effort it is to get going and keep going and control it, then we decided it was a dance pair.
And it was also impossible to get any more than 2 robots in the 8-foot by 8-foot space that we determined the piece should be. But to keep it going, it was great that with Peter, who's a media conservationist here at the museum.
And who thought he was going to have a simple and easy life until he met this piece.
Anyways, he came, I think, when did they come? Almost a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
So we also, there's a few versions of Killing Machine out there. So MoMA owns one of 3 or something. I'm not sure what it is. But we also have an artist proof that tours quite a bit. And so that's the piece that has been shown a lot and has gotten all these upgrades, we call it, so that we had different problems with different components over the years. At first, the motors weren't smart. Now they're smart. Now the robots know where they are. At least the little circuit boards know where they are, so that they're in the right spot at the beginning. I mean, because we build everything ourselves, we did some crazy light sensor circuit thing that would cross and it would stop there. And maybe if it flew by that, then it would start smashing into the other robot. And the robots are actually, they look fragile, but they're extremely strong because they use this, I can't remember the name of a gearing system, but anyways, and so they can do real damage to each other, and they have over the years actually done that.
And are they commercially available, or do you actually sit there and make them yourself?
No, we built the robots from scratch, basically. One of our main assistants, Carlo Cravato, came up with the idea for we sent him a bunch of sketches, and we brought him over from Berlin to our studio in Canada, in Grinrod, British Columbia, and he had this idea of these angle poise lamps being the...
like a desk lamp? That's how it started out with one of these things.
So, and we were like, yeah, desk lamp sounds great. So he designed the arm bit and built the whole system out of parts that we bought basically at we call it the Canadian Tire. It's a hardware store in Canada.
If you're a Canadian, it's like, the center of the world. Tim Hortons and Canadian Tire is everything you need to know about the country.
It's funny, when we moved to Grinrod, there was no Canadian Tire within 500, no Tim Hortons, but now there's 25 within 5 minutes. It's
Life
really,
has returned to normal.
Yeah, exactly.
It's because it's owned by Americans now.
A sad story. That's another sad story. But I want to ask you: are you the little boy that played with Legos? I mean, where does this kind? The French have a word, bricoleur. It means somebody who just puts things together. Is this something you were always interested in?
I don't think I was really. I wasn't that mechanically inclined in school and stuff. But then she makes me come do stuff. She goes, "Can we build this?" And then I'll be like, "Yeah, we can figure that out, sure." And I don't know. Over the years, I've just gotten better at. We both have actually, because she's a builder too, and we both do a lot of. And we like getting our hands dirty. I think that's what it's about. It's something to do with we like the mistakes that can happen when you're building something. Because if you give someone a sketch and you say, "Build this for me," it doesn't. You can get it back, and it's kind of like, "Oh, well, that's okay," but it's not really. When you're working with it and you're going deep inside of it, like when Carlo designed it, I still worked with him completely. He came to our studio. We worked together every day on it. And so if things happen, mistakes happen, and you go, "Oh, that mistake's kind of interesting. It moves differently than I imagined it would. We should use this. We should build on that." So that's kind of, and we just, we get lucky sometimes, and sometimes we don't. But
Yeah, it's like moving sideways. When you have a problem. One of the things with George is he's a really good problem solver. And also he has a special talent that I don't understand why, but if something's broken, even in the kitchen or something like that, he'll take it apart, put it back together, do nothing, and it'll work.
So do you do house calls?
Pardon me?
I said, do you do house calls?
Yeah, exactly.
So Jen, I want to.
It's kind of better when you know what was wrong with it, though. But
that's too easy. I want to sort of switch over to what was behind making this piece. In other words, it's such a viscerally powerful work. What was the initial idea?
Well, it's hard to. We were trying to figure out what exactly it was, but there were a few things that were going on at the time. We were in Berlin, living there, and getting the Herald Tribune every day, reading about the war in Iraq. And we'd produced a piece called Feedback, which was sort of one of the political sort of pieces we did with using a Jimi Hendrix. We hired a guitarist to play the Star Spangled Banner the way Jimi Hendrix did in Woodstock, sort of as in relationship to the war. But we were also, I love Kafka, so I was reading Kafka, and then I was telling George, got him to reread this story in the penal colony. And we started thinking about ideas of torture because all of a sudden all the images in the newspaper were all about Abu Ghraib. And then also we saw an Errol Morris film
called
around
Dr.
the time
Death,
called Dr. Death. So all this sort of came together.
Plus, we were living in Berlin, and it was rainy and depressing.
Yeah.
And the clouds come down, and the sun never comes out for months on end. And we're reading all these horrible stories in the Herald Tribune about people blowing up and bad things happening. The world was in a very, very dark place. I mean, it's dark now as well, but it was pretty bad. So we thought, and Janet says, well, this killing machine, we could build a killing machine, couldn't we? I'm reading the Kafka, and it's an incredibly complicated thing, right, with gears and wheels and pulleys, and I'm like, yeah, I guess we could do that.
So we went. I just have to say, we went to. We happened to be in London, and so we went to the Torture Museum there, and then we were also doing research on another project.
They're actually really fun to be with most of the time.
But when you start to do like historical research on anywhere in Europe, let alone America and different places, you realize how cruel people can be. Like Scotland is. It's just horrific what they did to people. Like
we just did a project
quartered
in Scotland.
them and like. Anyways, so I think all that was coming out, but because we are the personalities we are, and none of us like to be preached to, right? So we added the pink fund we added the sort of the TVs that become more like that you are a spectator, right? The TV's always on and stuff. So we added this sort of and the moon that comes on and the disco ball, and that was to kind of bring it into, entice the viewer in, sort of seducing the viewer. But it's also because there's always other things going on in the pieces we do. It's like we saw it as like a musical box. You press a button and all of a sudden the robots start. And when we were programming, just like George was saying, how sometimes during a piece of art, things change. All of a sudden we realized they're dancers. And so George and I were choreographing it by, moving, when you move it through the computer, somehow he does all this, but anyways, the robots would move, and so we had to program them together, and then then they go crazy. So it's almost like there's this weird romance going on between the two. I see it as anyways.
So talk a little bit about In the Penal Colony, because I do think it sets up both the issue of the robots as dancers and there's a kind of exquisite pleasure, despite the fact that this is a piece that also deals with, deep pain. So in the Penal Colony, it's kind of an interesting story. It's not one of Kafka's best-known stories. So do you want to describe a little bit what happens?
Okay, so everyone probably has read at least some of Kafka, so you know that things are very much about bureaucracy. And it's about a traveler who encounters a machine, and it's basically a torture machine that writes the sins of you onto your body, and therefore kills you through various. It's like a knife that goes down and it starts writing your sin, like stole a piece of bread or something like that, and over again until it kills the person. And what is fascinating about the story is that in the situation there's this bureaucracy, like the person who's operating and is very proud of everything, that how the machine can do this and how it can do this and now that. There's no humanity in it. And so there's this critique of bureaucracy in relationship to evil. And that's what really fascinated us, I think.
There's an S&M component as well, because the guy,
No, this is the part that I think is so interesting.
the guy who's describing the machine to the person who's in charge of it or taking care of it really wants to be killed in the machine himself, I think. And so, and that's what happens in the end, is how I'm trying to remember.
So what
now.
happens in the story that's so interesting is the bureaucracy takes over and cancels the death of the next victim, and instead its master, the man who was in charge of setting it up to inscribe the sins of each victim, he himself talks about it as a kind of exquisite death, and so he wishes to experience it himself, but the machine malfunctions and kills him, right? So the whole thing is about, pain, pleasure, chance, and takes torture to a very different level. And what I was struck by the first time I watched it was how painful the robots were. It was so aggressive. Those little like needles that jut out of each figure, and it seemed to me as if it was just all about pain and torture. And more recently, when I've watched it, it's actually very elegant. There is a choreography to it. There is a dance, even almost, and I wonder if it's an appropriate word, a playfulness to it.
Definitely. And pink fun fur.
Yeah.
And a disco ball.
Yeah.
I mean, so yeah, we were kind of pushing that, definitely, the pleasure pain idea, and actually, yeah, it's not funny, but there's I don't know, there's something about that.
There is a mesmerizing quality to it, watching them dance, because one of the things that I think connects it to a lot of our work is the way that technology is anthropomorphized, so that they really do become characters. They almost have their own personalities. And it's hard for us because we've seen it so many times and worked with it, but they do seem to interact. And as soon as the horn is speaking at first, then they sort of look towards the horn, and then so that we wanted to give them some sort of weird life. But it's more like those wacky sci-fi films like The Terminator and all that.
You can't see it in this image, but the robots, when they're seen in profile, actually have an almost human-like character to them, especially in shadow, where there's a kind of cable that comes up off the armature that almost is the shape of a skull. I don't know if I'm reading that into it, or...
Yeah, we never meant... I mean, they became what they became by what we bought, the components we bought, and the motors we found, and we call them flexible shafts that run from the motor to the arm that articulates it, makes it move. But they really, I think of them as bird-like, actually.
So there's a part of it that you touched on that I read differently than you, which is you talked about having to press the button. As I see that as having to implicate the viewer in the act. That, in other words, this is not, if you want this to happen, just as torture itself requires human action, that you put each of us in the position of willfully wanting to make this work to happen.
Yeah, that was actually one of the intentions too. Sure, but
no, for sure. I mean, the funny thing is how quickly people want to push the button. It's kind of distressing in a way. It's like, get that thing going again.
Well, I watched this afternoon
but it is
several people who wanted to do it 3 or 4 times, and you sort of say.
But it's very interesting taking it to different cultures, because we've shown the piece in many different places. And in Japan, it was like they almost had to be forced to press the button because of. I don't know why, because of maybe the timidness of the culture, or whether it had something to do with the scariness of the robot or something like that.
The button press was also practical in a certain way as well, because of the mechanics not being so always reliable. We were hoping that it wouldn't play so often, and it wouldn't be on a loop mode, so that it would only play when people were actually in the gallery. Of course, here at MoMA, it just plays constantly, so...
But it was more aesthetic, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I was always thinking, well, it's great to have a button, so it's not playing when no one's in the gallery.
Well, and that desk presumably is to evoke the sense of a bureaucracy, of the kind of mythic commandant who.
We definitely were thinking of that, the control booth or whatever. You're sitting at the desk and you're conducting the robots or whatever.
And the idea originally, actually, when we were looking at it today, we were reminded that when we started out, we thought it would be, we created these shelves. And we imagined that it was a piece that was found in an old warehouse that was no longer used. It was a torture machine that didn't need to be used anymore. And so what we had collected, what we had done was collected items that looked like torture items from all over the place. And we had them all over the shelves and everything like that. And then when we started working with robotics, then we realized that it was just too much, right? You know, it's part of the experience of being an artist that, or the way we work anyways, and that's why we have to make all this stuff, is that we tend to throw in a lot of stuff and then we reduce and then we reduce, and sometimes we don't reduce, but there's this point where all of a sudden we feel, yeah, that's working, right? Now it's the focus on the robots. And then we started using the light change to work with the idea of theatricality of torture, which is also important to the S&M, but also to our cultural use of it. And
well, that's why the TVs, we brought the TVs in as well. They come up at the end, and it's kind of symbolizing the whole media sensation around all violence at the time, because and it's still going on. I mean, at the time, though, it was insane how much the media was just so intensely excited about covering the war, the two wars, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, the torture, whatever. It's just this kind of almost an orgy of excitement about that. It's like our ratings can never get any better than this. We're so excited about it, right? But we're critical of it, but boy, it would be bad if it stopped, right? Because our ratings are going to go down.
But maybe there's something else we could talk about with this too, is this idea of magic. That's something that really interests us. The idea of how we can go through this sort of we take ourselves outside of ourselves, and we love to watch something as it plays, right? It's watching puppets, or it's watching a magic act, or something like that. And we tried to have a little bit of that kind of element to it.
Well, a lot of your work, especially your early work, with building these mini theaters, seems to me as if it was to create this magic moment, something that brings a certain amount of pleasure, maybe even a kind of mystery about how things work. And do you want to just talk a little bit, the Paradise Institute, right, which is both a kind of mini, it's theatrical, it's a model, it's so many different things, but I just remember walking into that and smiling and just thinking, wow, how did they get all of this to work?
Yeah, we used the binaural audio in that. Like, that's part of the magic. I mean, Janet's walks are all done binaurally, which is this, it's a special way of recording sound, so it appears very, very realistic to you when you listen back over headphones. And so we actually recorded the whole audio inside of a real cinema, so you felt people moving beside you, and we recorded the audience, and we actually got our friends to hang out and make snide remarks about the film that we shot and things like that. So yeah, there's all this comedy, like Carol and Christophe Bakarjev is saying in Italian, she answers her phone on the cell phone, and she says, "I can't talk right now, I'm in a cinema," So lots of in-jokes and things like that. But with the Killing Machine, the magic really comes, it's different, isn't it? Because there's this point of suspending your intellect that we're very interested in. The moment in a film, when you go to a film and you're totally immersed in it, you forget that you maybe left the stove on or something, right? Which we play upon in the content of the film in the Paradise Institute. But Janet says, I can't stay, I have to leave. I think I might have left the stove on. She keeps saying this.
Then what
At
happens?
first she whispers to you, "Do you remember if we turned the stove off?"
And then what happens?
And then she actually walks out of the theater and leaves. And I still...
But then in the end of the film, on the screen in the mini
yeah.
theater, there is, we burnt a house down. So there's a film of a house on fire.
As I said, they do nothing but cheerful things. No, but I want
That was fun.
But to come back to sound,
Yeah.
I remember at some point talking with you, Janet, and you mentioned that you have that sound you feel acutely in perhaps ways that some of us don't. That it's a very, well, again, visceral dimension of how you experience the world. Is that accurate?
I think so. And I've realized over the years that many people have different senses that are heightened. Like some people have an amazing sense of smell and taste and all that stuff. But for me, it was always perhaps it's due to my background, but I think it's just the sensibility was brought up with and genetics or whatever, that I'm acutely aware of sound, and that I can be shocked easily and jump a foot and scream and everything like that at any little sound. But it's also an awareness too that I feel like I almost see like when I'm imagining the installations we're making, the thing that really interests me is the physicality of sound. It's a pleasure that I get through just imagining how the sound is physical, and it's hard to describe, but that's one of the things that, I want to do in Motet, 40-part Motet. One of the things we want to do in all the binaural audio walks and the video walks and things like that. And a lot of things like Murder of Crows, where the sound moves around the room and stuff. We want to give the physical presence of the sound and show how it is affecting you. It hits your body. And, but yeah, I definitely have a heightened sense of sound.
We were talking about 40-part Motet earlier before all of you joined us. And for me, that work, which we premiered in New York at MoMA PS1 shortly after the attacks of September 11th, 2001. So it's indelibly etched in my mind, but I think in the minds of many New Yorkers who had a chance to see it, as almost an antidote to that horrific moment. When you conceived it, did you think of it as this extraordinary release, emotional engagement, that almost euphoric work, or did you think of it just purely as, how can I make this 40-part motet, 40 different voices, feel just present in space?
Well, the piece of music is beautiful, even if you're listening on two speakers, right, in stereo. But I was listening on two speakers, and it wasn't necessarily, it was a beautiful piece, but at the same time, it was, I just imagined how it could go, that you could move the sound around the space, and if you had an actual choir and you recorded each singer separately, so that then you could walk around the piece and almost compose it yourself. So it was much more almost a conceptual approach that I was thinking about.
But you knew the piece was, it's an amazing piece of music. And what I think
when
you said to me, you were like, it's dead in these two speakers. It's not alive. It needs to be, it's 40 parts. He wrote 40 parts. Let's record it in 40 parts, put it in 40 speakers. And she said, and that'll be easy, won't it, George?
Of course.
And I did my best to discourage her. So I said, no, think about it. Like, you're going to have to buy.
2001, you got to remember.
2000, actually, we're working on it. And we've been invited as a team to work on the Venice Pavilion. So we're also thinking and working on that at the same time. So I'm trying to focus on that. And she's coming up with more and more ideas, of course. And anyway, so she comes down I came down, and she'd been playing this in our living room in Alberta we were living in at that time, and says, this will be amazing. And I start going on about all the negatives, like, so you got to hire a choir. You have to have a big, huge sound system with 40 microphones or more to record the choir. You have to hire these guys from somewhere, and then you've got to buy all the equipment, the playback equipment, which barely existed at that point that we could get. The system now, we don't use it anymore, but it had just come out, this system that could play 40 tracks at once. We had to have 2 synchronized machines and stuff that we could afford, actually. So it was basically, I said to her, look, you're going to have to spend $100,000, and you won't even know until you press the button in the space. You also have to find someone who's going to show it. You won't even know until you press that button in the space if the piece is any good. And she says, just trust me, it's going to be great.
I've heard that before, not from Janet, but from my spouse.
And I've learned that it's, I just trust her. So.
But I have to say, just a point about synchronicity, because like George said, the technology just came out. He started to research it, and it just came out. It wasn't possible before, as George said. But also, at the same time, Teresa Byrne, who runs field art projects in London, England, she invited me to do a project. And I said, well, I have this idea. Do you want to produce it? So she raised the money, and she sort of she was musical background, so, and she hired the choir, hired the recording thing, and everything. We recorded in England, so.
If you haven't heard the piece, I urge you the next time either we have it on view or someone else has it on view to go and experience it. It's absolutely...
The last part and the first part.
Sorry, Glenn.
There you go.
We'll just show a short piece. So this happened, I'll just pause it if I can. I'm not sure if I can. So, sorry. What were you going to say?
What I was going to say was actually just what you were showing, that in addition to the incredible sound of this Thomas Tallis motet, the genius of the work is to capture the singers before it even begins, the rustling of people preparing, the whispers to each other. You not only you're put in their space, so that you're already with them before they even sing. Sorry.
And so that was just an accident that happened during the recording. So we were recording in Salisbury in the medieval hall, we covered it with blankets because we wanted to deaden the space as much as possible so that the reverb provided would be from the actual space it shows in. So that's why the spaces really changed the piece.
And you just sort of call up Salisbury Cathedral and say, I need the space for a couple of hours?
No, Teresa Byrne worked really hard on that one.
But anyway, so...
Actually, we used that choir because we wanted children, because this piece can be recorded having the sopranos as females, but it's special having children. I just didn't realize how hard it would be to have children doing this piece for 3 hours and recording them and getting a decent recording.
But so at one point, one little girl had to go to the bathroom. She went off, and we both said, we got to record this because everyone's talking now, and they're just talking about their day and where they were. And so I ran out to the truck, and I told them, keep rolling. We want to have this. And so we got all these really interesting conversations because they were all... It was the Salisbury Cathedral Choir, but it was enhanced by probably another 20 people from all over England, and they'd come in that day.
And horrific weather, as usual.
In horrific weather for England, of course. And they had all these different stories. And so if you stand between the speakers at this point, you can hear the baritone speaking to the other person, and it's really great.
Play a few seconds of it just so people can get a sense of what it's like to be there. That's a very different piece.
But the other thing is, there are actually 60 singers because traditionally they use 3 children.
So these are some kids who are having some trouble, and they're talking to the conductor about the bar.
We'll get it right.
That's the conductor talking.
I'm doing it there. That's B, that's me. Oh, you should be there.
And then he says, unless there's a calamity, I won't stop. Because it's all useful stuff, isn't it?
It's almost cruel to stop it. So that's why I urge you, the next time you have an opportunity to experience it, to do so. But I want to take the arc back to the Killing Machine, because what I, at least for me, had always thought of these as a pair. One as this extraordinary spiritual antidote to the problems of the world, and the other as this visceral recognition of the cruelty of man. And I don't know, they were done almost 7 years apart, 6.5 years apart. Do you think of them at all related, or for you there's just so many intervening works that they don't connect in the way they do for those of us who think of them in their New York context?
Well, for me, I think it's the idea that George and I really like when we can get an emotional sense to the work. Like when I go to this 40-part motet shows a lot, and we have a tone meister who sets it up all over the world. And when I go to the space where it's being set up, and I know that the space is actually working with the piece, I get kind of a tingly, and I almost get weepy myself, right? So I know that the sort of the emotional resonance of the composition and the words and everything about he's trying to get, I think, the Queen to come back to God, and this idea, it's very, very spiritual. But at the same time with Killing Machine too, there's this sense that it's an unidentifiable emotional response for me in ways, and that it's a kind of a playful, but it's a mesmerizing, but it's still it's this idea that you're letting yourself open to it.
I've read critiques of The Killing Machine that talk about the playful dimension and are troubled by it, that somehow the issue of torture, whether it is Abu Ghraib or whether it is Kafka's meditation on it, doesn't lend itself to the disco ball and flashing lights and that more playful side of it. Are you troubled by that? Do you think of those as in any way antithetical to each other?
Well, I think that, as we talked about earlier, if you're really critiquing, and if you're thinking thoroughly about the levels of how the media presents ideas of the torture and everything, it is playing into this idea of society being voyeuristic, and media, as you know, is just, it's so much about the various levels of entertainment. So I'm not worried about that, because we trust our own intuition. When we're working, we work together and say, does this work? Does this work? We had various music working with this thing, and we knew it didn't work with it. And we found this sort of very strange music by Frida Abtan, a composer from Montreal. And it has to have the edge. It's like black comedy. Mm-hmm. I think it works. And it's like before when we were talking about, we do not, there's some political work that really, really works, and it's very serious. And then other times, I think you have to sort of like entice people a little bit and let them come to the conclusion on their own.
Yeah.
One of the things I'm really... Did you want to say something, George?
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the things that really... I actually think the disco ball does something else besides becoming entertainment or evoking a dance hall. It creates these extraordinary shadows. Yeah. And I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about what happens there.
Yeah. And I also think because it moves the room. The room starts moving around you, and it lends more to your disorientation of space and time. I mean, I think the piece is 3.5 or 4.5 minutes long in total, but it's kind of like a journey for me. It starts out with the winding up of the whole machine. We wanted the beginning part where it goes, you can hear this. The whole thing's kind of, the speaker's going around in one full arc, and it's like someone's winding the music box up for us. And then the killing part is in there, but then there's the whole other thing, that we call it the love dance, where the two robots are like, starting to maybe like each other more than they should. And then with the disco ball, I really feel like it's hopefully putting the viewer into another space because of the motion of the whole room moves basically. So that, and especially it's kind of wobbly and shaking. And
I was also struck by the use of color. There's a moment towards the end where you get this burst of red and green that just pops at you. And do you think about color? I mean, in other words, is color to you as visceral as sound is?
Well, you can go ahead, but it's the first time it's the second time. We started using lights in opera for a small room for the very first time, theatrical, lighting-based, to tell a story in a kind of a way. I mean, we're not always telling a story, but there's a movement or a traveling going on in a time-based piece. And so... I'll just bring opera up. So this was the year before Killing Machine, basically, opera for a small room. And we worked out this system of controlling lighting, which was, so there's all these, and it kind of relates in a certain way. There's no evil story, it's an opera. This guy's living in a shack, perhaps, playing records. He's got 5 or 6 or 7 record players, and they're robotically controlled. So also it relates to the Killing Machine because we started using computers with control systems in this piece here, and the lighting changes.
But I think also George and I did our undergraduate work in painting, both of us, and we're formally trained when it comes to sort of art making, and we sort of got into films after that, and we got into different things. But color is definitely something that we think about when we're producing the piece, whether it has to be very austere, like for Depart Motet, so you just hear the sound, or Murder Crows. But whenever I see the red come on in Killing Machine, I always think about blood.
Yes.
Right, so and then the mood of the blue is, and you see the moon up on the wall. It's kind of like, well, where are we? Are we in a barren landscape on our own or something? Are those stars, the disco balls? So it brings in sort of the world and different things. So definitely, I think we use the color evocatively for that.
A work like this obviously has multiple lives, right? You create it and then it goes out into the world. And I'm interested in what happens over, now it's a decade of being out there. It obviously changes as technology allows you to improve its mechanics. But does the piece change for you as time progresses in terms of its meaning, its impact?
It's hard to know when you're so intimately connected to a work, but and then the politics just keeps changing. But I think one of the other books that we were very influenced by was 1984. And I think that book is still as relevant now as it ever was.
Or more so.
Like I reread it right after George Bush was in, and I started thinking about, and the Iraq War, and going, and one of the main themes in the book is, which war are we in now? And
the endless wars.
So it was so that I think that it's no, I don't think that the meaning keeps moving on, which is kind of depressing in ways.
Yeah, because we thought of that as the dark period, but the dark period has lasted quite a long time in the last 20 years, I guess, since 9/11, basically. I mean, a lot of our work has a lot to do with that turn of the time at that point, and how things changed in our world, and how, pre 9/11, the biggest story in the news was, Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, and it was like, and those times are it's kind of sad in a way that those aren't the things that we're worried about now. There's so much more that we're worried about.
But one other thing is that it's kind of apocalyptic now. I mean, you look at Australia and what's happening. You look at different things that are happening. So this idea of the original, where you find this machine that's abandoned in a warehouse, maybe in a country that's been abandoned. And so to me, things like that become more resonant, that when there's the whole issue of how our world's changing.
Let's take a moment and turn to all of you to ask whatever questions you might have. Please, there are microphones around, and if you feel moved out, yes, down here.
Hi. So I really was moved by the piece, and I couldn't help but feel like a connection to a sense of queerness in the piece. In a sense, the disco ball is kind of a symbol of queer culture, dance culture, marginalized people having a safe space to be free. And yet, I also can't help think of the epidemic of addiction in this country, and in the queer community, it's at a higher rate than the general population. And I thought about that idea of pain and pleasure, how the very community that gives you pleasure could also be the very community that's killing you. And so I guess my question is, in terms of like the more colorful aspects of it and the theatrics of it, how do you understand it perhaps in the lens of community and freedom, in terms of where is the safety of expression? And if there's no safety of expression, how do you find joy without hurting yourself and your loved ones, your community?
Well, first of all, I appreciate your comments, and I think in relationship to what we were talking about with Glenn, and having it is not super directed, so that it can be open to so many interpretations. That's one of the things we try to do with all the narratives and that we work with, so to bring in other people's lives and memories, and they're able to connect and show the universality of all of us. But and the idea of joy, what did you say with the?
The idea of joy, of finding joy without having to hurt your loved ones and your community.
Yeah, that's a very important issue for us now. So I'd like that interpretation. Thank you for thinking of that.
And we'll go up to you.
Hi. What does there's one part that they say something, but I couldn't understand what it was.
Oh, that's an old vinyl from the 50s of teaching people how to type. So he's just saying,
Sit up straight.
sit up, yeah, put your finger under your palm, place your hands on the keyboard, and then he starts telling what letters to type. So it's we found it kind of resonant because it's basically giving you directions on how to do something. And we were thinking of the person in the desk who would be instructing the robots, and he's kind of the character.
But it's the writing on the body from the penal colony.
Yeah, exactly, and it relates to the writing on the body from the penal colony.
From the Kafka story. Yeah.
It's kind of creepy.
I was about to say, it also adds a really sinister dimension to it, right? Because the music is creepy, but it isn't so creepy that you're reacting to it in a very negative way. And the robots do their thing, but it isn't until that voice interjects that you come back to this. It's people doing this to other people. It's not a machine doing it. It's people. Yeah. And it's such a, I don't know what he was trying to get out of his students, but that was just very sinister voiced. Do you read it that way?
Yeah, well, one of the things, you're just reminding me now that we had a whole script written. Remember, we even recorded it and stuff like that and had different voices coming out. And then we realized that is just like too directed and badly written and just doesn't work. It just it directs the piece way too much. So when we came across, we had an instructional, aerobics old LP too, and that didn't work. But then the typing just seemed to work, and then it resonated with the story, and it's creepy, and it's like, yeah.
And his voice is super creepy as well. I mean, you don't want to be sitting there typing with this guy.
You sure don't want, well, you really don't want to be making any mistakes with him.
Yeah, exactly.
There was a question over here, please. No, we're recording it for the people on live stream, so they can hear you as well.
Got it, sorry. Just, you were talking about the physicality of sound and the role of shadow in the piece, just because the shadows, the way they're against the wall, you feel very you feel even like you're up close or intimate with the piece. The color reverberates even strong. It's so large. Like how did you consider that? How strongly did you how much time was spent thinking of the shadow puppetry elements with the computers?
Well, we always knew we wanted to have we're very influenced by Tangley in this piece, I think. And Tangley did numerous pieces with shadow and movement, of course, kinetic sculpture. And so we were thinking about that all the way through. And then where we placed the lights and everything, it was about, and also making the robots bigger than they were, but not going overboard with it either. I mean, it's fairly subtle in some ways. There's one point where the robot comes out at the audience, and if you're in the right place, the shadow actually comes over and it looks like it's hitting a person in the crowd, and that was intentional as well. I mean, the lights get bumped because the machine is shaking all the time, and so they don't always end up in the right place. But Peter comes in and checks them every day, I think. So.
And we really liked how at one point the robot comes by and it bumps the disco ball. And we left that in because we liked how it destabilized you as a viewer. Because you know how if your environment, when you're on a boat or something, your environment changes, your body feels like it's destabilized. So that was kind of fed into the concept.
Yes, Wendy?
I'm curious about how you came to the realization that you wanted to work together. And when do you work together and when do you decide to work solo?
Well, we started, actually,
Well, our very first date was kind of a collaboration.
Okay. You can start with that, yeah.
He was a painter, and I was actually doing my master's in printmaking, but we liked to record audio, or anyways, we just I invited him to a concert. We recorded the concert, and then we went back and had some beers and watched TV with the TV off, but playing the what was the music?
Hiroshima Mon Amour was on late night TV in CBC.
But what was it?
They used to play great movies.
Contemporary sound band, so it was like all this crazy sound.
Nexus. They were called
anyway,
Nexus.
so that sort of thing. But when we started working, he would always help me in my work, and I would help him on his work. And then at one point, we couldn't remember whose idea it was, so we decided that we'd start.
So that was the Dark
making
Pool.
official collaboration. But I think what really worked with both of us, and what people are amazed at, is that we've been married an awful long time, but we're able to. We cook together, usually pretty well, and but it's because our talents are different, but we trust each other's opinion completely. Like if I come up with an idea and I show George sketches and stuff like that, and he goes, "It's a bit corny, don't you think?" You know, I'll trust him. And go like, I'll see it from a different perspective, and I go, "Yeah, you're right." You know, and he says, "Well, what about this?" You know, he'll come off with another totally different idea, going this way, or a couple days later, maybe he'll come up with an idea, or vice versa, that sort of thing. And so I think that's what makes it work, because I love going to museums. I love looking at paintings. I love looking at this and that and that. And I'm not sure George likes looking at art.
Ouch!
That's just not true.
But, you know, we have different sensibilities
Just
about what we like.
because I don't spend as much time as you do. And I like different works. It's kind of interesting because we do also agree on a lot of work, but we do tend to like different works.
But
And
to follow on Wendy's question, because I was rattling around in my mind a little bit, how do you work together? In other words, it isn't the amount of creative juice that's required to make these extraordinary works is so intense and so great. Is it just always bouncing it around, or is it sometimes, you know, you saying to George, "You just go off and deal with it," or George saying to you, "I'm not going there. You run with it," or is it everything, or is everything a collaboration?
when we get really busy, sometimes we'll say, "Okay, you have to focus on this, and you have to focus on this." Like in the last year we were working on the instrument of troubled dreams. So that sort of, in a way, I mean, it became, I did a lot of the legwork on that, I guess, or the recording. Like it's a lot of recording and there's a lot of building. But then Janet would always be coming into the studio and contributing, like saying, "What are you doing? What are you thinking about? That sounds terrible." And then, but
there's a script
she
with
was
that,
working
so-
on a script for our next video walk piece that was in Edinburgh. So she had to focus on that. But still, then she would and she would always be giving me the script and telling me to read it. But I was too busy, and she'd be going, "You got to read the script. You got to edit the script." So I mean,
plan the production.
We do both. So she expects me, even though she writes probably 80% of the scripts for those video walk type pieces, I'm still expected to contribute and pull and keep my end up on that. But sometimes we're just too busy that
And then the video walks, he carries the Steadicam and does but I'm right behind him in
Voice.
with actually watching the
wa-
monitor
and-
so that
and saying-
can help him with that sort of thing. But it comes down to the different talents, like he was saying about working the instrument for Troubled Dreams, which we're going to be actually showing in New York in about a year, less than a year, and
Troubled Dreams up there.
and I was writing, there's some narrative within this piece. It's like you press on a button, you get a whole soundscape. It's like a film that you can make yourself. But I was writing narrative for it and recording my voice for it. And then we were editing it together. And then he edits some of the dialogue and then, says, "What do you think of this?" So it's really, it is the...
Close my eyes and turn my face into her pillow. I can still smell her hair.
Sorry, I just thought I'd roll a little clip of that.
It's very much about what we enjoy doing. Like, I like doing rough editing, but I can't stand doing the fine-tuning of that, where he's super good at
So in this one,
fine-tuning.
though, Janet wrote a whole kind of script.
I did.
Oh, you did all
I
that?
told
Okay,
her,
I was
yeah.
focusing on getting that there. What did I do on that piece?
Well,
So I
George...
wrote the program. Did you tell him that?
No, the software...
But they work really well together.
The software program written for this was just beautiful visually. Like, it's just like all these spider webs and everything, and so he wrote that.
Oh, thank you.
Are there other questions that anyone would like to ask? Yes, please. We'll get a microphone for you in a moment.
Thank you. First of all, I loved the piece. Everything came together in such a beautiful way. The music,
Thanks.
the shadows, the light. And I think everybody has their own associations. when looking at it. I kept going back and looking at it over and over again. And I hope you're not insulted if I say that it reminded me of the haunted house at Disney World. But
at Disneyland? The haunted house?
Yes. Really? Because it was the same, kind of spooky, but under control. But on a more serious note, I wonder if you're familiar with Stanley Milgram's obedience experiment. Because this idea of pressing the button and thinking that you're inflicting pain and seeing how far people are willing to go.
Yeah, definitely, we read about that. Yeah,
yes.
And how shocking it was that how much people would increase the pain as well, and just normal people. I mean, kind of unbelievable.
The banality of evil.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
Yes.
But the Disney house, haunted house thing, it's funny because when we were working on, where was it? The Paradise Institute. Or was it before that? We visited Disneyland. We've only been once, but it was about maybe 15, 20 years ago before we did any of these major works. And we really had it wasn't the haunted house that we liked as much, but we really liked the tiki room with the birds singing and the rain going down the outside of the windows. And we were like, wow. That's a piece right there. And then also the Pirates of the Caribbean ride was before they Johnny Deppified it. I guess now that they have Johnny Depp in there, but it was just a ride. There was no movies. It wasn't a big deal. So we went on that because there were no lineups. All the other rides were just jam-packed. And the Pirates of the Caribbean is this great ride where it's just you're just in this mood and you just float through this different spaces and cannonballs go over and weird things happen and
bad little animatronics.
Yeah, it was fantastic. Yeah, so we do appreciate Disneyland, and your comment about Disney is not taken badly.
And did you have a question?
No.
Except for that,
that's just
because
what came to my mind.
Because there's another study too about how they allowed some people to be prison guards,
yes,
and others not to
the
be.
Zimbardo.
That's another horrifying,
That's
another
also,
horrifying thing.
Yes, I'm familiar with that.
So you have people who love to go to Disneyland, but at the same time to take part in these studies, and so the complexity of human nature is. It's complex.
Is there a last question? Does anyone? We'll take one more question if there is one. Yes, down here. No, we just need the microphone so people who are streaming can hear us.
I'm just very curious about this very cozy blanket, because if it's remind me, my grandma have the same. I always wants to lay down. It's so comfy. But then I hear all of this sound and this robot and the shades. It's just, what can you explain this? Because it gets so much. It's took my attention and I want to lay down, but then everything what I see around is just.
Well,
thank you.
I think at the time I remember we had the dental chair. That was a real score at a secondhand place. And then we had a lot of other things set up, and it was all kind of like somber. It was all very kind of like blah, blah, blah. And so then I went and bought a whole bunch of materials. And I thought, well, this might be interesting. This might be interesting. When we put the pink fun fur on, we went, that's kind of weird, kind of Caucasian fleshy kind of thing. It's kind of creepy in ways, even though it's, and this whole idea of the artifice, right, of the pink fun fur, and it's put the skinning of the animal and.
And it also comes directly from the book, actually, because in the Killing Machine, in the penal colony, Kafka describes that they use this sheep's wool to absorb the blood of the victim. And so we wanted to refer to that, but we didn't want to be too heavy-handed, so pink fun fur seemed to be a compromise.
I'd forgotten about that, that's right.
So to all of you who have joined us live stream, thank you for being with us. To all of you in physical space with us in real time, thank you for being with us. But most importantly, to Janet and George, thank you for sharing your incredible work with all of us.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you, Glenn.
I didn't get a chance to thank MoMA, though, for the incredible work. I think Peter is up there. I see him. Such a long process, the whole conservation, and we're really stoked that it's here. Thanks.